Hey class, this PowerPoint is all about biodiversity and why it's important. So far we've talked about the different levels of organization, starting with the smallest level, so think about them before I say them, but we have the smallest level, which is the organism level of ecology, where we studied what niches and habitats were. Zooming out a little bit, the next largest level is, think about it, the population level, where we can study size and growth of populations or a group of organisms of the same species. If we zoomed out even more, next thing we studied was communities, which are a bunch of populations together and how they interact. So we studied symbiosis, like mutualism, parasitism, predation, commensalism, and competition. And we also studied succession. And if you zoom out even more, we can study ecosystems, and we can also study biomes, which we studied last semester. But we have one final thing that we can study in ecology, and it is the entire biosphere, which is the sustainable portion of life on Earth. And so it's important when we study ecology to study the biosphere and study biodiversity as a whole and why it's important. This PowerPoint is extremely important for your human impact projects. It shows you why biodiversity is important in the first place. It shows you some of the human threats that you guys are researching presently, and it also goes over ways that we can help our planet in the future. Now here's what you really need to pay attention to. There's a lot more words on these slides than you actually need to write down. You do need to write stuff down in your notebook, but you're only going to write down stuff that's in red or stuff that you see that is underlined. And then do that on slides with stars on them. And I'll usually try to point them out to you, but if you want to write more than that, that's up to you. But just telling you right now, like the only stuff you would really need to know or study for the test is the stuff in red or stuff that's underlined. The rest of the stuff that I'll discuss today is important, and it enhances the discussion so that you have a good idea of what biodiversity is and how we're impacting it, but only the red and underlined stuff is essential to write down. So this is just an objective slide, not necessarily super important to write down, but just understand that the main idea that we're going to be talking about in this section is that biodiversity maintains a biosphere that's healthy. If we want a healthy biosphere that all life can live on forever, we need to have biodiversity. So we need to know what that is. So this is a slide that you will be writing down red and underlined stuff for. So go ahead and copy down what you need to, and then pause it, and then press play when you're ready to move on. So if we're going to talk about biodiversity, we should also talk about extinction. Hopefully you know what extinction is, but extinction is when an entire species permanently disappears from the earth. They've just all been wiped out, and they will not reproduce anymore. They will not pass on their genes for their full species anymore. And this is a concern because every time we have extinctions that happen, we are reducing biodiversity. So biodiversity is the variety of life in an area. The picture you see to your right is a very biodiverse ecosystem. This is a coral reef, and coral reefs have a wide variety of different species that live in that area. Biodiversity increases the stability of an ecosystem. If an ecosystem is going to be stable, it should have a lot of members in its food webs to provide energy and to provide interactions like mutualism and commensalism and even predation. So having a very biodiverse ecosystem helps keep our whole biosphere, a whole planet, healthy. Now there are 3 types of biodiversity, so you want to write this question down, and then on the next 3 slides, make sure you write down the red and underlined stuff for the 3 types of biodiversity. So the first type of biodiversity is genetic diversity. You want to make sure that you know what genetic diversity is. Genetic diversity is just the variety of genes in a population. Simple enough. Genetic diversity increases the chance that some species will survive. So we've actually we will talk about this when we talk about evolution, but populations that have more variety, so what we can see when all of those fish from the different habitats, all those different colors of fish combine into a pooled population, there's a lot of genetic diversity, there's a lot of variety to that pool. Now that variety is going to ensure that even if there's some crazy disaster that happens and it wipes out all the redfish, the rest of the fish in that species are still going to be able to pass on their genes so the whole species survives. Without genetic diversity, there's way more likelihood that the species is going to all get wiped out. Now, another type of biodiversity is species diversity. See if you can guess what this is first. You do actually, I know it's not in red, but you should title it species diversity. But species diversity is the number of different species that we have. Now, genetic diversity, the genes in a population keep that species around. But we need lots of different species. Sorry, that's the SSR bell. Okay, now it's done. It's a number of different species, and we need a rich number of species in order to keep our food webs healthy. Remember, if any species dies from a food web, it's going to affect the entire rest of the ecosystem. The more species there are, the healthier and more stable that ecosystem is. And finally, the third type of biodiversity you need to write down, I know it's not in red, but please write down ecosystem diversity, which is just the variety of ecosystems we have. We have lots of different ecosystems that all have different factors. We have deserts, we have tundras, we have rainforests, we have temperate forests, we have all those different ecosystems and biomes, and each of them has their own characteristics that help support different types of life so that we have the vast diversity that we have on Earth. So now let's get to the importance of biodiversity. Please write the title down at least. We're going to talk about the 4 reasons why biodiversity is so important to the planet. So remember, you're only writing red and underlined material down, so don't get too overwhelmed by the amount of words on this slide. But one of the reasons why biodiversity is so important is because we are directly and economically impacted by biodiversity. We, as humans, depend on plants and animals for food, always, clothing, energy, medicine, and shelter. And without biodiversity, there's a lot of that that's going to get wiped out. So genetic diversity is especially important, and we need to make sure that we keep genetic diversity around, because if every organism is a clone that we use for food, we may not have important food sources around anymore. So a couple really good examples of this are bananas and GMOs. So bananas, the bananas we have in the grocery store now are not actually the species of banana that we had even 50 years ago. They used to actually taste a lot more like banana flavoring, like banana Laffy Taffy kind of flavoring. But they were all wiped out because they were all clones of each other. They were wiped out by a virus. And so we had a new species of banana that we modified and are now selling in our grocery stores. But those bananas are now also getting infected with a type of banana virus. And the problem is all of the bananas that we have in grocery stores are seedless. They're all clones of each other, which means if our entire banana species goes extinct, we're either going to have to find a new banana that we like enough, or we're just not going to have bananas anymore. And they're very nutritious foods, so it's quite concerning. GMO crops are also very low in genetic diversity or biodiversity, and since they're so low in biodiversity, you may have read this from the article that we had to read, but they will actually, it's very concerning, they might lower the amount of genetic diversity that we have for our food sources. So if they get wiped out, we don't have those crops anymore. We also benefit from biodiversity with medicines that we have to treat diseases. There's a lot of medicines that we use that come from plants from very diverse places like the rainforest. But if we keep destroying the rainforest, then we're destroying the habitats and the ecosystems that support our future well-being. And we can't afford to destroy our ecosystems for those purposes. So we directly benefit. Next one, we indirectly benefit from biodiversity as well through services that we can't make money off of, but we still need to survive. So the other slide was talking about ones we can make money off of as well as we need. But there's things, so remember, just write down the red, but there are certain things that the biosphere provides that we need on Earth that we can't put a price tag on. They're just so essential. Healthy biospheres, healthy ecosystems with a good amount of biodiversity provide lots of oxygen and remove carbon dioxide. They provide us with drinking water. They protect against floods and droughts. They help us have healthy and useful soils for many generations. They can detoxify food and water for us and decompose wastes. And our biosphere helps to regulate our climate. The biodiversity we have helps to regulate our climate. If we continue down the path of getting rid of biodiversity by causing all of these extinctions, we're not going to have as much benefit from our ecosystem in the future. We won't have as much access to these very essential requirements. So this is an important slide for you to copy down because it shows you some of the services that we do get. You don't have to draw the pictures, but at least list these things that the ecosystems do provide for us because of biodiversity, such as oxygen and recycling nutrients and climate regulation and purification of water. These are really, really important for our well-being and for the planet's well-being. Other things that you may want to write down. So the ecosystem provides us with food. It provides us with wildlife habitats, provides us with pest control that's natural and not chemical. But if we reduce biodiversity, we get rid of all of these services that the environment is supposed to provide for us without any sort of harm. Okay, moving on. There are two other values. So yes, we directly economically benefit from biodiversity, but we also indirectly benefit economically, but we need its services. However, it's also important for you to understand that we benefit from biodiversity from an artistic or aesthetic standpoint, as well as from a scientific standpoint. So it's hard to put a price on something you find beautiful or something that is interesting to study, but our world and our human way of life would be very, very, very different if we didn't have the biodiversity we did. Think about all of the movies, ever that you like from when you were a little kid, like Little Mermaid or Lion King. Those things would not be around if we didn't have biodiversity to inspire us to make them in the first place, or Finding Nemo or something like that. But a lot of our hobbies have to do with nature as well. If you like photography, if you like art, there's lots of things that have to do with nature and biodiversity, and it just makes us happy. We need to be happy every once in a while. If we get rid of biodiversity, there's less uniqueness in the environment to make us happy and to inspire us to do better things. But also, without biodiversity, there's a lot of scientists that would be out of a job. I'd be out of a job, if we've only got, two types of animals and plants on the earth. So scientific value is also important. Humans are naturally curious. We love to study things. But if we reduce our biodiversity, we don't have much left to study. So we need to learn not to harm our creatures, but to study them and help preserve them for the future. So we will review this tomorrow, but please make sure that you recap for yourself the 3 types of biodiversity and the 4 reasons why we need it, and then we'll move on to the next portion of this. So the following slides are all threats to biodiversity. You will need to know some of these for your test, so I'll point out the ones that you need to take notes on. The other ones may just help you for your human impact projects. So as you listen, be careful for which ones that you need to write down, but for the other ones, just sort of listen and get an idea of how you can use this information for your human impact project. So you don't need to write anything on this slide down, but humans do threaten biodiversity regularly. There's lots of things that we do to harm biodiversity. Excuse me. Okay, sorry about that. I got a phone call. I completely forgot where I was, but we're just going to go ahead and move on to the threats to biodiversity now. So you definitely want to write this one down. Make sure you write the red and underlined material. But we're going to discuss overexploitation, which is the excessive use of species for economic value. So this is basically we kill animals because they have something we like. Like ocelots in that top picture, their fur is beautiful and soft, and so we have endangered them drastically, not made them go extinct yet, but definitely endangered them because they have beautiful fur and we like to skin them for it. Or rhinos. Rhinos are endangered because we like to specifically just use their horns. So a lot of times poachers will actually go in and just cut off the horn and leave the rhino to get an infection and die. They may not actually outright kill the rhino. Historically, we've done a lot of overexploitation. We overkilled bison. We've overkilled all sorts of different organisms. And it's usually because, you don't need to write any of this down unless you want to, but it's just extra information. But we usually overexploit because humans like stuff. We like having food. We like having treasures. We like having things that make us happy. So we do things like overfish because we love sushi. And we fish so quickly and so rapidly that we don't let the populations replenish themselves quickly enough. And we poach because we like things like ivory. The bottom picture is an ivory tusk made from actual elephant tusks. But we really drastically harm the populations while we do that. So we have a picture of a poached rhino. It has its horns cut off, and it inevitably will get an infection and die from that. So another one you need to write down is habitat loss. This is something else that humans are doing to our ecosystem. We are definitely harming biodiversity by destroying habitats and disrupting habitats. So when we destroy or disrupt habitats, the native species will have to be relocated or they will die. So we destroy habitats by clearing homes through deforestation or pollution of water. We disrupt habitats when we do things like overfish and we take away food sources from other organisms in that ecosystem. So the destruction of the habitat is actually like taking away the home, but the disruption of the habitat is things like destroying the food web. So an example of habitat loss is deforestation, and I think one of the groups has to talk about deforestation. So when we cut down trees, it takes away homes for lots of different organisms, and it can reduce biodiversity that way. If you take away their homes, if they can't move to a new place, all the organisms that live there may die, and that would reduce biodiversity that way. So that's a serious, serious problem. But it can also, with deforestation, it can also make it harder for our climate to stay normalized. So when you take away all of those trees, there's not as many plants to take in carbon dioxide, and that is actually indirectly impacting climate change. So you don't need to know about edge effects, but essentially what happens is when you split up ecosystems, it makes the smaller ecosystems less diverse. Something I do want you to know about is pollution, so you definitely want to write this down. I know there's a couple groups that have to talk about different kinds of pollution. Remember, you only need to write down the red stuff unless you want to write more. But pollutants are harmful materials that enter the biosphere through land, air, or water. So there's lots of different pollutants that I know a couple groups are going to discuss, such as discarded chemicals that run into the water or run into soil and then get into water. Any wastes that or sewage compounds that help algae grow or spread disease, and fossil fuels are examples of pollutants as well. So you will definitely need to know about biological magnification for your test. You definitely want to write down the red and underlined stuff. But one type of pollution that happens is biological magnification. And biological magnification is a specific kind of pollution where pollutants get into the water and they can disrupt an entire food chain. So an example was in the past, we used to use a pesticide called DDT, and we loved DDT. We sprayed it all over our crops. We sprayed it all over humans. We sprayed it everywhere because it would kill pests so that our crops would grow. However, the DDT got into the soil, and it ended up getting into the water. And producers use water as part of photosynthesis, so some of the DDT was getting into their tissues. Well, primary consumers would eat the producers and get that DDT in their tissues as well. Small fish eat a lot of zooplankton, so they get a lot of DDT in their tissues. Large fish eat a lot of small fish, so they get a lot of DDT in their tissues as well. And finally, birds of prey eat a lot of fish, and those large fish that have a lot of DDT goes into the birds of prey's body as well as they build their muscles up. Well, this became a huge problem because a lot of birds of prey would go to lay eggs. But when they would lay their egg shells were so soft that when the moms went to roost on the eggs would get squished and no babies would hatch. And so we kept wondering, why the heck are all of these birds endangered species now? These eagles and all sorts of other birds of prey. Why are they endangered? Well, it's because their eggs were too soft to hatch any new babies, and we tracked it down the food chain to actually being caused by a chemical that we introduced into the ocean way before this. So we didn't foresee that this was even a thing that would happen, but it did happen. And the moral of the story is that a lot of times humans like to try new things without understanding the effects of them completely, but that definitely will cause endangered species and extinction, lowering biodiversity. Another one that you should know about is acid rain. I know a group has to talk about acid rain, but there's a lot of compounds in air pollution that can actually rain down along with precipitation, and it can destroy trees. So the tree picture that I have right here actually is a cause of acid rain. So the acid rain has actually destroyed the plant life in the area. So here's a picture of how acid rain works. We have pollutants in the sky, but those pollutants come down with the precipitation and they can damage the air. Or, I'm sorry, damage the plants on land and the soil. So there you go. Okay, one you definitely need to know for your test is eutrophication. So you want to write down the red stuff. So make sure that you know how to pronounce this as well, eutrophication. Eutrophication is actually a type of pollution that's caused by nitrogen and phosphates that end up in the water. And a lot of our dishwashing detergents and clothes washing detergents include these substances. And so when they get in the waterways from us washing our clothes, washing our dishes, washing our hair, etc., they actually promote the growth of algae. When algae overgrows, though, it actually depletes the resources necessary for everyone else living in those waterways. So the algae will overgrow and block everything else and basically suffocate all the other organisms that live in the area. And this is caused by pollution from humans that allowed the algae to overgrow. So other sources of pollution, you don't necessarily need to write these down, but just so you understand them, definitely air pollution is an issue. Smog, we can see, is something that's caused by all sorts of different pollutants from machinery altogether that gets into the atmosphere, and it actually affects people's health. So here are some, reasons for smog's existence. So automobile exhaust, industrial emissions, and we can see in areas where we've gotten rid of smog, the health of the people living there, especially their respiratory health, is a lot better than areas where there's smog. Another one you definitely want to know, and I know that we have a group that is going to be presenting on this, is introduced and invasive species. Introduced species are species that humans bring to a place or to an ecosystem where they don't belong, and invasive species are ones that move there on their own. But introduced and invasive species can harm biodiversity because they weren't supposed to be in that ecosystem to begin with. Ecosystems have their own food webs and their own balance, and when you introduce a new species in there, whether it's predator or a new prey, it's going to affect the balance that those food webs had before. So we bring invasive species in because maybe we like a certain type of plant and we want it to grow in our garden, or maybe when we travel, organisms may get caught on ships or planes or cars. Things that we don't really expect to have problems can have major, major effects on biodiversity. So even just bringing in a cute little animal that you want as a pet, if it escapes and it actually becomes part of an ecosystem that it doesn't belong to, it can outcompete every other species and can reduce the biodiversity there. So I know I said review the 8 threats to biodiversity. Review the ones that I told you to know for your test. Those are the ones that you absolutely have to know. You have to be able to identify them and give examples of them. But all the other ones I discussed, we're going to talk about with our human impact projects as well. So hopefully that helps you. Okay, the next and final thing that we are going to talk about is how can we conserve biodiversity now? So I want you to write this question down so you know where we're going with this in our notes. We know what biodiversity is now. We know that biodiversity is helpful to keeping our biosphere healthy. It gives us direct economic benefits. It gives us indirect but very important benefits. It gives us, happiness and joy from aesthetics, and it helps us have stuff to study. But we've learned that we've done a lot to destroy our biosphere and biodiversity as well, such as introduced species, overexploitation, habitat destruction, pollution, all of those different things. But there are some ways that we can help solve these problems. And so this is one of the more important topics that we'll discuss in this class because it will affect you in your future. So, you don't need to write this slide down, but this is just an explanation of what natural resources are. Natural resources are resources that we can use and that come from nature. And there are two types, and you do need to write down the two types that I have in red. There are natural renewable resources, and there are also non-renewable resources. So make sure you know these. Renewable resources are resources that are replaced by natural processes faster than they are consumed. So the sun, solar energy, there's always a lot of it. We can, use as many solar panels as we want. We don't have to worry about not, having sunlight anymore. Agricultural plants, if we grow crops responsibly, they can keep growing even though we take the food off of them, so we can keep growing food. If we farm animals, we can responsibly replace them faster than we consume them. Clean water as well. As long as we keep our water sources clean, we should have plenty of water from the effects of the water cycle to sustain us. Same thing with clean air. As long as we do take care of these resources, we should have them as long as humans are around. But there are some non-renewable resources that are found on Earth in limited amounts. So once we use them up, they're basically gone because it's going to take way too long for them to be replaced. So fossil fuels is an excellent example of this. All the gas we use to power our cars, to power our homes, power our electricity, everything like that, based on fossil fuels. Once we run out of fossil fuels on the Earth, we're not going to have them anymore because it's going to take way too long to produce more. Those fossil fuels are basically fossilized dinosaurs and fossilized plants. So, it'd take way too long for us to get those back. So we should be coming up with alternative sources of energy. So you definitely want to write down the underlined stuff here. Conservation is the wise management of natural resources, including the preservation of habitats and wildlife. So we have lots of conservation strategies that I'm going to go over on the next slides. And you want to understand ways that we can conserve our biodiversity. Now on these next slides, it's really up to you how much you write down or how little you write down, but you at least want to listen because I know that there are questions that come up asking you what are some ways that we can conserve biodiversity, so you want to make sure that you have some examples. So we can actually fix problems like desertification and soil erosion, which means basically getting rid of all the nutrients in the soil. And we can fix this by doing things like plowing land to reduce erosion, leaving stems and roots from the previous year's crops to hold the soil down but also provide nutrients. And then instead of what we do with GMOs, which is called monocropping, where we just keep growing the same crop in the same field over and over and over again, and it just keeps depleting resources from the soil, we can alternate what we grow on a field every season, and that can introduce new nutrients to the soil. So if we plant a field with rye one season, instead of just letting it sit or growing the same thing over and over again, we can actually introduce new nutrients to the soil. So we've caused problems like deforestation, but we can either harvest just old enough trees, mature trees, and let the new ones grow enough so that we have a bunch of trees ready to go. We can always plant new trees, and we can protect our forests more. For fisheries, we've overfished, okay? So we have taken too many fish out of the ocean. We actually don't see nearly the size nor the amount of certain species that we love to eat as we used to, and it's because we just love them so much we took them all from the waterways before they were able to reproduce or get big enough again. But we can use fisheries to help us sustainably grow these fish that we really like to eat without depleting the ocean ecosystems and the biodiversity that lives there. So by creating regulations, we can help fish populations recover as well. So raising them as well as protecting the ocean fish will help us with our overfishing problem. So the picture on the left is a picture of LA, I think in the 70s, versus if you look at it now. And that's because we have drastically regulated the amount of pollution we can put into our air. So with smog and acid rain, there were a lot of health problems, and we noticed that. So we have very strict standards on how many emissions cars can have and how many emissions industries can have. And so it has reduced pollution drastically. And we also need to make sure that we're taking care of the water we have itself. So if we use too much water at one time, then we're holding it up in places where other places may need it. So it's really important that we protect our waterways that already help to purify our water so it's not polluted, but we also do watch our water consumption at home and in agriculture so that every ecosystem can have the water that they need. Now finally, sustainable use. Sustainable use is using resources at a rate which they can be replaced and recycled while preserving the long-term and environmental health of the biosphere. So if we're going to use sustainable products, we will need to use things that will reduce the amount of resources that we're using, use renewable resources responsibly, recycle our resources, and make sure that we're preserving our ecosystems. Sustainable use of products is possible, and it is necessary if we're going to keep not only the human population going, but the planet's health going. Instead of using non-renewable resources, instead of overusing our resources, we just need to be responsible about using them. This may mean creating technology that will actually help to support our biosphere more and support these recycling efforts, these anti-pollution efforts. But we need to explore those types of green technology and those types of sustainable technology so that we can keep our planet around and healthy. So, to sum up, we've learned a lot of things in this unit. We've learned the levels of organization, symbiotic interactions, succession, habitats and niche, weather and climate. We've learned about the greenhouse effect, populations, how they grow, how they shrink, the types of growth. We've learned about carrying capacity and limiting factors. And today we learned about biodiversity, why it's important, how we're harming it, and most importantly, how we can fix it. Please make sure that you study this material. I will be posting a study guide soon for you. And also make sure that you're using your understanding of what we've learned in this unit to build really excellent human impact projects. As you go through those human impact projects, I want you to make sure that you are paying very close attention to how we've threatened our environment with those threats, but also how can we fix those problems using sustainable resources, using some of the solutions I mentioned on the previous slides. So thank you for listening, and feel free to watch again if you need, and have a good rest of your day.